Cheap recipes from the 1960s were the secret to keeping a generation happy and full for mere pennies. In today's inflation, it's wild to think just a few cents could cover an entire meal, but for them, it was simply life as usual. Hamburger pie was actually an immensely popular recipe that was widespread throughout America during much of the 1960s. It was a big part of the culture that was enveloping the whole country, which was the idea of making convenient and easy meals that were also light on the budget. The 1960s was a time of casseroles, one-pot meals, and buying canned and pre-packaged food because of how much the workforce had become active after the disastrous first half. The hamburger pie was right up the American people's alley because it was a really good all-rounder that you could whip out for a number of reasons. Family dinner, me time on Saturday, or just a celebration at your household. People could also serve it with all kinds of sides too, and despite how there was a focus on making your food easier to prepare, people were pigging out. Could you blame them? It had been a while since most Americans could reliably wake up to their favorite foods. This dish offered you the familiarity of a hamburger in the form of a pie, and those sides, such as mashed potatoes or collard greens, really helped to bring the entire picture together. You could even bake this into a casserole, and that's also a part of why it was so common in cookbooks and community recipe collections. Speaking of casseroles, you might actually be surprised by all the different kinds you may find during this era. See, thanks to the Depression, people had really opened their ideas of what a casserole could be far more than ever before. As a result, you had things like macaroni and tomato casserole popping up, and this was a pretty good dish for several reasons too. Firstly, macaroni wasn't expensive at all, and neither was ground beef. It was a really convenient family recipe that you could hold for Sunday dinner or even play around with to switch things up. Maybe you used sausages instead of ground beef. Maybe this time, you put in bell peppers, or topped it with breadcrumbs, or really went crazy with the cheese. All these little things made this one-dish meal a world of fun for home chefs who were still looking for an easy-to-handle dish that let them try out different ideas. People really did like their cheese, though, and they didn't hold back on the ground beef for this. As far as the public reception went, there was definitely a crowd of people who thought they wanted to keep tomatoes and macaronis out of their casseroles and only in their pastas, but for the most part, people loved it. American-type goulash became a comfort food that was known for so many things that made your life easy. Simplicity, typically, was what people wanted during this time. Think about it. Work culture has only gotten worse in our generation. You come home clocking that 9-to-5 shift? What's the first thing that goes in your head? Maybe hop in the kitchen, thaw some chicken, and dirty your hands with some spices and grease? Come on, dude, no. You want to catch up on some Z's. Take a power nap. Get some of your pep back, you know? American goulash was such a good dish exactly because it let you do all of these things while still having a full stomach. In some places, you'd call it chop suey, but really, depending on the region you were in, you would see something entirely different. Some people had the whole thing consisting of this rich tomato sauce with diced and boiled tomatoes to go with it. Others really thought you couldn't make it work without a big focus on ground beef. This was the most popular option since, out of everything, ground beef being the center of the dish made it both affordable and familiar. Then, some people also really liked elbow macaroni. It was a pretty common sight to see in American goulash. The dish tasted very homely, and you could feed a family of 5 or more with one batch. Remember how we were just talking about the way people decided to sometimes mess around with their casseroles, switch out the ground beef and put in sausages instead? Yeah, they had a name for that too. It was called hot dog casserole. Like almost every casserole that made its claim to fame during the 1960s, this one had a heaping serving of pasta. Actually, elbow macaroni is something you'd see a lot more often with this one, mixed in between patches of gooey cheddar cheese and diced or cut up sausages. It was actually a pretty economical dish, and that's why it got popular in areas where common ingredients weren't so readily available. Let's talk about personality, though. Do we take this over a hot dog? How do we feel about the casserolification of almost everything? I mean, before I told you this, your idea of a hot dog was probably just the typical street food dog you get in a bun. Then again, Maybe this is an idea worth trying? If sausages can work in a hot pot, there's no reason they can't work in a casserole. What do you say? In what form do you think the hot dog shines through more? Now, the macaroni mass movement has also spread to other dishes and facets of American culture, like our dear old chili. Chili with pasta is something you'd see all over the 20th century, but the chili macaroni fusion had not happened properly until the middle of the 20th century. It was actually thanks to all the economic struggle that was going on at the time that people decided to work with a dish that could be adapted with macaroni like this. Since macaroni itself was extremely filling but not too strong in the taste department, and since chili had nothing to offer you but flavor and wasn't really that filling, the mix was obvious. Both the dishes had a mutually beneficial relationship to gain from working with each other, and Americans are nothing if not people who have a keen nose for opportunity, especially with food. Thanks to that, the Chili Mac combo became a massive hit throughout working-class homes across the United States. This was seen as a wonderful one-dish meal that could tend to almost every need you had while still being superbly easy to make. In the 1960s, Beanie Weenies weren't some kind of cute wintertime trend with beanies or a Halloween candy. They were actually something you'd see in school cafeterias almost all of the time. Why? What is a Beanie Weenie? Well, despite what it sounds like, it's actually a pretty good mix of baked beans, hot dogs, and some ground beef. This meant that it was one of the most popular mixes for parents to make during times when they had to get to work, but their kid had to get to school faster. If you're one of those people who never finds enough time to make a breakfast from scratch in the morning for their little critter, I think you might still see the value in something like this. How did Beanie Weenies emerge, though? Well, between pop culture references in shows like The Simpsons and The Goldbergs, a list of stores in every area selling affordable canned versions of the ingredients, and Beanie Weenies in general sneaking into all aspects of American life, even the military, I'd say the dish has had many places to grow some really positive PR for itself. Corned beef hash was a real silver lining for most people to look forward to. While corned beef itself came out of Ireland, it got to the US by the 19th century, but by the middle of the 20th, it was obvious that this Irish invention had made a very American home for itself. Lots of big-name corporations also helped spread the hype around, typically Hormel's. They were the most affordable ones to get, and they were also the best quality for a few reasons. That shelf life was really nothing to scoff at, and it was a pretty hefty serving of beef in a very transportable can. Corned beef has such a rich history throughout the 20th century. In the 1960s, it was a fast way to get mashed potatoes, vegetables, and a protein on your plate and chow down. Just 20 to 30 years before that, it was actually one of the biggest things you needed to make sure you had because it was a big part of most people's very frugal daily diet. We've taken a lot from our European neighbors over the years. Cabbage rolls were just another thing that we adopted from places far beyond American soil or shores. Once you try them, they're actually significantly better than most people give them credit for. Cabbage rolls used to be known by all kinds of names in different countries. It was typical to make it with a combination of beef and pork, and then mix in buckwheat or rice. People also put in fresh mushrooms or some fruits, and you might be thinking, okay, but where's the cabbage roll part? All of this was centered around the cabbage. You wouldn't get big, generous servings of all these sides. They were just there in the roll to make the cabbage better and to fill out the meal a bit more. Think of it like a taco, you know? The cabbage roll was a big part of the World War II era diet that most people had grown accustomed to, and that's maybe why some people nostalgically still ate this. If we go back just a bit before the war and right towards the start and middle of the Depression, you'll find that chipped beef on toast was actually one of the most common things to eat, especially across working class and rural households. There were people who had their own farms and space to grow and raise their own cattle. They would often enjoy the best versions of these. Then the rest of the population would usually be working on much tougher and cheaper cuts of meat from unwanted parts of the animals, like the back or the shoulder. It meant that the quality of the meat was something you had to work around, typically by slow cooking it so you'd get some tenderness. Still, most people really just had bread to work with. The bread was also very prone to going stale, and the beef wasn't something you could use in decent or large amounts just because you were having a bad day. It was the Depression, you know? Everyone was collectively having a bad day. Chipped beef on toast was an easy way for people to spice up their bread just a little while still being able to eat a decent breakfast. Slumgullion stew is an American dish that became known for how easy it was to prepare. I mean, seriously, you think of stews, and your mind immediately goes to all the hard work and blood and sweat that goes into making a proper one, especially if you're cooking for a decently sized group. Some of these stews could get real costly too, but not slumgullion, no. This dish was a comfort food recipe that had been twisted, diluted, and transformed in so many ways across the decades, but still always managed to retain what made it work. That's very rare for most recipes, as they often lose their original essence in translation from one era to another. A slumgullion stew typically looks like lots of beef, macaroni, greens like canned tomatoes, corn, and beans. And they would also throw in chili beans and vegetable soups to add to the broth. By the 1960s, suburban living had become the norm, and a family diner was what most people were buying their groceries for. Slumgullion stew was a mouthful to eat and say, so it worked really well. Potato pancakes are a lot more cultural than you think. They're deeply rooted in European Jewish traditions, and even in American Jewish communities, you always find this in someone's fridge. They have some pretty strong links to the cuisine, but despite that, the 20th century was a time when America really became known for being a melting pot of different cultures. Before that, you could say that each place had its own identity, each state its own little corner of Uncle Sam's backyard, but now it really is all one big pot. In the United States, they're typically something most people link together with Hanukkah, but they're also a really big comfort food outside of that too. There's some practical history and some cultural Jewish history to this. So, practically speaking, during the Depression and wartime, people almost exclusively lived off of potatoes. Potato skins, potato soup, potato pancakes. I mean, it was one of the cheapest and easiest ways to get a pancake during then. From there on, it took off so well that most people just kept making them even after the dust settled. It was a pretty endearing exchange of traditions from one community to another. And to be honest, I think I like potato pancakes more than the original. What about you? Would you ever try a starchy variant of a typical American breakfast? Or are you booking it straight to IHOP? I'm glad potato pancakes and jambalaya are next to each other, because both are some pretty fine examples of how a lot of typical American meals are influenced by the many cultures and communities that exist within the nation. Jambalaya, for instance, is a Creole and Cajun original that comes right from the heart of Louisiana. It's got a fair bit of heritage from other cuisines too, namely Spanish and French ones. Jambalaya was typically introduced to the people by French settlers who had brought on most of their recipes and ways of cooking during the very early colonial time of America, specifically Louisiana. What they didn't foresee is that one-pot culture would end up popping off so well in America, and that's exactly the mold jambalaya fit into as well. Even up in the land of the oui-oui, or as they call it, France, they would typically cook this in one pot. In Louisiana, though, in the rural patches of land surrounding the state where plantations were, it was a typical meal there since a lot of the dish was centered around rice. And that was a staple. In the 1960s, Southern cuisine, especially out of places like Louisiana, had really stretched out to other parts of the country. All of this note-taking from other people's books has a reason, by the way, and I'll get into that later. Speaking of Southern cuisine creeping into other corners of the country, pimento cheese sandwiches are the quintessential Southie dish to talk about. As far as sandwiches go, they've pretty much nailed the formula. You have a taste you won't really forget thanks to the wonderful usage of pimento cheese, which is really just cheddar cheese mixed with small red peppers known as pimentos. Then, you have the sauces and vegetables. People like to keep it pretty simple, nothing too fancy. They'd throw in some red onions, or normal ones, and cloves of garlic. Some cayenne pepper and jalapenos would make it even spicier, but some people really preferred their cheese sandwiches that way. I know that at least more than a few people really enjoyed doing it this way, up in the South. As far as sauces went, most people stuck to Worcestershire sauce for how it would really add some depth to the dish. The pimento cheese sandwich was one of the best things to come out of the South because it was such an affordable and delicious meal to make. Pimento cheese wasn't really the hardest thing to get. If you lived near any kind of grocery store, then there was a pretty good chance they had it. Most people in the South also either grew their own peppers or had dedicated shops and spots for where they'd go. Everyone had their own favorites when it came to where they'd like to get their vegetables, so depending on the harvest, you'd also get some pretty different tastes. Pickle roll-ups, on the other hand, were a wonderful party-time snack that became the star of two types of gatherings: cocktail parties and potlucks. See, in potlucks, it was really common for people to bring one of everything and just have a lot to eat for the family, but cocktail parties were an entirely different kind of beast. The post-World War II era in America was a strange one. It saw lots of cultural shifts and new trends that people couldn't have ever guessed would make some serious headway into the mainstream. Despite that, these parties that were pretty much just wine-tasting parties but with cocktails turned into little competitive nights where people would compare their finger foods and the host would try their damnedest to pick a menu that suits everyone's tastes. By the end of it, no one would really even get drunk. What they would get, though, is pretty tipsy. And you must not be a stranger to the need for snacking that arises when the drinks start hitting. Casual gatherings that were cocktail parties also saw a lot of use for pickle roll-ups, and as far as snacks went, this was a pretty good option for hosts who couldn't spend a lot of time doing prep work. Scalloped corn is a strange one. It's a creamy casserole, but it takes all kinds of ingredients that you wouldn't ever see in a casserole. I'm talking about things like corn, milk, eggs, butter, and sometimes even actual scallops if you lived in nearby coastal cities throughout the Midwest. In terms of texture, it was honestly less like a casserole and more like a custard or pudding. I mean, the cheese was really the most casserole-esque part of the whole thing. By the way, when people use the word scalloped in reference to old dishes from the 60s or any other era, they mean a baked dish that typically tends to come with some kind of cream sauce. It may also have breadcrumbs, but you get the idea. Corn, I get. Look, the past 3 decades, corn and the American people have had a bond that goes beyond just being best friends. It was the only thing that was there for them throughout so many nightmarish situations. Still, eggs, milk, butter, what was the idea here? Anyway, would you try this, or are you glad that this is one dish they left behind in the 60s? Stuffed celery sticks are one of the nicest appetizers you can actually get. Despite what you may have originally thought, there's more use for a celery stalk than you could imagine. All you need to do is get yourself accustomed and familiar to the wonderful world of fillings. I'm talking about cheese spreads, jams, chili fillings, and peanut butter. If it can hold itself inside of a celery, it can work. Besides, people wouldn't just stick to these ready-made fillings. They'd try to look for things they could make on their own, too. Making your own fillings for dishes like stuffed celery sticks was really common. After all, people were finally getting back into home cooking and how much they really enjoyed it. Stuffed celery sticks are actually some of the healthiest meals to eat, too, because they take advantage of a trend that started off early in the 20th century and use it to make an otherwise boring vegetable the talk of the whole table. Stuffing vegetables started somewhere between the 1920s and 1930s as a way to make a dish heavier so that you would go longer between meals. Luckily, it stuck around once people saw the crazy appeal. Go to the Midwest, roam Detroit and Chicago, and for a few blocks or neighborhoods you'll find lots of Chinese food, but out of all that, what will really stick in your head is egg drop soup. The cultural movement of Chinatown's Chinese food and a general dip into Asian cuisine was something that was primarily contained on both the East and West coasts, but it was also popular in the Midwest. Now, if you actually did live on the coasts during all of this, then you definitely know what I'm talking about. San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle, every major urban hub had a pretty large population of Chinese Americans, and egg drop soup was a pretty key item on the menu. These cities were really nice centers for people to try out Chinese food, especially because you could get the authentic stuff from immigrants who were working in restaurants. It was a big way of introducing the American population to more cuisines outside of their own. and I dare say they liked it enough to make it a mainstay. Plus, even if you go to the East Coast or the Northeast in places like New York or Boston, the trend of American food mixing with Chinese techniques and recipes was rising so much that it was hard to believe these were the same people who didn't know a thing beyond chow mein just a few years ago. Meat turnovers in the 1960s were a really common choice of snack during the 1960s, and this is actually something we entirely have fast food culture and industrialization to thank for. The 1960s was a time when companies were slowly realizing the sheer goldmine that is convenience food. Canned food was just the start, the gateway drug, if you would. The next step would be to go on over to frozen foods, which is exactly where you would find most of the stuff for a meat turnover anyway. The rise of frozen beef, pork, chicken, and sausages, all of it meant that you could now have ease of access to meat dishes like literally never before. The best fillings throughout most homes were things like beef stew fillings or lots of diced sausages, often drenched in a spicy gravy or cheese mix. Beef turnovers were some of the nicest ones to come out of it, really. You would wrap all these frozen meats into one flaky pastry, and that was that. There were all kinds of options for it, too. You could get Stouffer's, Banquet, and Callender's, all of which even started pulling out their own frozen turnovers. It was a cash cow, one after the next, and no company was not taking advantage of it. So, I talked a lot about how potlucks were basically this little nice family thing where people would get their picnic on and bring all kinds of dishes to the whole thing. It was a nice little event, you know? One of the traditions that came out of that was the potluck mystery dish. For this, basically, suspense was the name of the game. Each potluck would involve one specific person who would be in charge of bringing the mystery dish. So, usually there would be some kind of coordination or pre-planning. People would talk to each other. Dave would ask Jack if he was bringing the ribs, and Sarah would ask Caitlin if she was bringing the fried fish fingers, that sort of thing. Here, though, nobody had any clue. The best part? It was entirely up to the chef what the mystery dish would even be. Dishes were always prepared using pantry staples, and no one was bringing in something like a casserole, so you'd actually get all kinds of wild cards from this. Sometimes you'd get a Jell-O sandwich or a gingerbread stuffed with cheese, or an entirely new kind of stew. Sometimes people would play into the unpredictability and bring in an old classic knowing that a simple answer wouldn't be what people were expecting. No matter what the case, it was pretty fun. Since this is the decade of casseroles, it would be pretty disrespectful if we didn't talk about one of the most influential ones ever. Savory bread pudding was a casserole entirely made out of eggs, milk, cream, and bread. You might be thinking how something like this could ever be called a casserole, since it sounds like downright blasphemy, but hold your horses. It was a typical 1960s meal in lots of places, specifically rural ones. If you ever had a bad case of stale bread and leftover milk and cream, or if you just wanted a nice dessert with a comforting consistency, then you'd definitely go for this. Some savory bread puddings also included meats like ham, bacon, and sausages, though it was mostly just sausages since they were the most popular thing to add in this decade. The draw of this dish would be how it had a crispy exterior, but a very soft, almost porridge-like core that would make digging into it a delight for your senses. Some people would go the vegan route and add all kinds of vegetables like green onions and spinach. Even green peas were popular. You'd combine all of these and bake the bread, and the end result was something that grandmothers in particular loved making for their doting grandkids. Hobo stew is a funny one. It gets its name from the lifestyle that people were living in the Great Depression. That was a decade marked by people drifting in and out of the edge of poverty and the very rock bottom of it. Most people were working in unmaintained environments or cooking right over open fires. The stew got its name from how rustic it was and how it typically was made in places like this during this time, but it's actually named that out of endearment. People thought this stew was a sign of how they really didn't want to be done in by the Depression and how they were just struggling to get by only one more day. It was a one-pot meal that you really improvised and used a lot of hands-on ingredients instead of a dedicated shopping list, but somehow, that's exactly what the 1960s wanted. Lots of Depression and war-era dishes still stuck around, or at least their concepts did, because of how they were so adaptable to a fast-paced environment. If you ever had the time to spend doing lots of prep work and just needed to get to work as soon as possible, this is the kind of stuff you could go for. Mock chicken legs were a result of mock culture, which was pretty much another Depression-era special. The whole idea was to mimic the most popular foods that people used to make with what used to be their everyday staples in the pantries. That stuff wasn't becoming available anytime soon, so people decided to mimic those flavors and textures with what they had. Luckily, some of these stuck to the wall a lot better than others, mock chicken legs being one of them. They were kind of popular throughout the 1960s, not too much, but not so little that you could completely write them off. They were affordable, and hey, the vegans loved it. Besides that, people thought they could probably do with a little less meat in their diet anyway. Just look at this list. How many meat-heavy options could you spot? I mean, neither you nor I are doctors, but I think you'd agree with me that maybe we have a track record of overdoing it? This country is full of meatheads after all, and they caused a ruckus back then over this too. People were complaining about it being fake meat and having all kinds of nasty additives that would give you stage 3 colon cancer or something. It was really just textured vegetable protein though, and these were substitutes for meat that were specifically designed to appeal to a vegetarian crowd. Plus, they were stupidly cheap. It helped when you couldn't afford regular meat, even if you were a vegan. I can't begin to tell you what a novelty canned meatloaf was. You take the darling sweetheart of every American's diet and put it in a can, make it easy to carry around, and sell it for like $1 or $2. You're sitting on a perpetual cash generator machine, and, well, lots of those CEOs are pretty well off now. Don't you wish you were born just a few decades ago when all these ideas hadn't happened and you could get rich off of them? Me too. Anyway, canned meatloafs were the next step in convenience food culture, and honestly, one of the things that made it such a prominent shift in the landscape of American eating. The cultural makeover that was happening, thanks to canned equivalents of everything Americans typically ate, meant that more and more people were deciding to spend their grocery money on canned food. Was this always good for you? Kind of. I mean, if even your home cooking is dominated by the idea of convenience and so is your takeout, then it's no wonder that lots of people thought the 1960s was where Americans really started getting a bit lazy and too focused on the 9-to-5 lifestyle. Still, canned meatloaf wasn't even bad. It was actually just as good as the real stuff, which was a surprise at that price point. America was going through more than one renovation when it came to its taste buds, and Chinese food making its own personal, long-lasting mark on the whole scene was one of them. Chow mein pie, for example, was a part of both trends. The casserole craze that had enveloped the entire country, as well as the need to explore foreign cuisines from other countries, typically from the global South and Eastern Europe. This dish had its glory days right after the World War, more or less in the 1950s, but it was actually one of the go-to Chinese dishes for Americans. It was either chow mein or chop suey, and most people never really explored anything beyond the two. Then came in chow mein pie, which took the familiarity of chow mein and mixed it in with the casserole format. It meant that the dish now became a one-dish meal that you could make in advance and even serve pretty conveniently. It also joined both traditions with experimentation, as you now had a typical American casserole but with entirely new Asian flavors. Then, canned soups and chow mein noodles that you could get that were already pre-cooked made things even easier for most people. America's moved past its experimental stage with food, which is why this dish wouldn't work today. But back then, it was definitely something new, if nothing else. We're going to end this list with perhaps the biggest experiment people ever did, which was mixing vegetables, particularly salads, with Jell-O. The end result was the savory jelly salad, which was, to say the least, pretty divisive. The savory jelly salad is infamous, and some would even say notorious is a better word. It was a dish that you would see in all kinds of cookbooks and family collections from the 50s and the 60s, but it wasn't something you would ever see in restaurants or salad bars. People would take conventional salads like tuna salad and ham salad or even Waldorf salad and mix Jell-O in it. It would usually be set with colored gelatin, which at least made them look very pretty. The public reaction to these was insane, though. Some people thought these new kids were taking things too far and ruining American eating, whereas others were finally happy to have a salad they could vibe with too. What's your take on gelatin? I don't hear about it too much in our age, but I think it's still got a way better rep now than it did back then. Would you ever try a savory jelly salad, and do you think it's as healthy as a normal one? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, it was wonderful guiding you through the culinary history of our country. Oatmeal went out the window, and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. At bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings, so depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. Despite the prices of white sugar dropping as a whole after the First World War, leading molasses to decline in popularity, they made a strong comeback as the engine fueled a great batch of molasses cookies. People also started abandoning white sugar during the Second World War, and it caused them to look for alternatives for their yearly Christmas baking sessions, and the government was already pushing on molasses for widespread public use pretty hard. Eventually, people saw the value, and the ones that did not have to because it was so much cheaper to get molasses than any other ingredient. That, along with some sorghum syrup, meant that people could still enjoy a fresh batch of hot cookies and warm milk to welcome the winter. It might not seem like much, but maintaining tiny traditions like that meant a lot to people and kept their spirits going as the days got harder and costlier. It was rare to get protein from actual meat during that period, but that didn't stop people from fulfilling their cravings by dabbling in mock cuisine, such as the popular mock fish fillet. While this did not actually use fish, it imitated the texture and flavor with pints of milk brought to boil, ground rice, chopped onion, and leeks, with the end being a good stir in a properly beaten egg. What you had was an excellent mimicry that felt close enough to the real thing while being distinct and offering a new experience. Nowadays, this recipe is used in vegan communities, but its origins come from very anti-vegan places, and it would be a great substitute for actual fish and chips as well. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day. Literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game, and this was one time where being patient really paid off. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. Bubble and squeak was something that completely fit the situations most people would find themselves in during the war, because this dish is all about the leftovers. Usually, Sunday dinner's leftovers would be used in a bubble and squeak to make sure nothing went to waste. Plus, people would definitely take that sentiment to heart when it came to holiday dinners where there were enough things left to constitute at least 2 or 3 meals the next day. Usually, this dish is made with potatoes and cabbage and is fried, so it goes properly and amazingly with some potato flotties or other items on the list. Maybe you can take a note from people's books the next time you think you have nothing to eat, but plenty of things still left. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. Bacon. Crackers, I mean, sure, they're pretty good even as a typical easygoing breakfast, but what do we really do here? You eat something enough times, you tend to get used to it and get bored. How do you get around that? Well, since the topic is retro dishes, we used to hear a lot about bacon bow tie crackers back in the day. It was something you could find for breakfast or a cocktail appetizer, which is some serious versatility. The crackers were extra crispy since they were wrapped inside bacon and then baked until the bacon itself was pretty crispy. It was the perfect combo, and all they needed was each other to realize that. It was smoky but sweet. It was also savory, but buttery smooth and not dry at all. Dishes that are such neat little combinations like these are often hiding right under your nose, and if we didn't have the imagination of so many home chefs who found these and got them into the public sphere, then we'd be a lot more tasteless as a country. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Shortages were extremely common right up to before Pearl Harbor and especially after it. This is what led to things like Woolton pie dominating the mainstream, even though the dish would probably not see the light of day in normal circumstances. It is just that things like pies, loaves, pizzas, etc. had all become unattainable desires that were out of the public's grasp, more or less. Something had to be done, though, because not only did people need to be fed, they needed to be reminded of why eating good food is one of life's best joys. A hot, nice meal can do so much for a person's soul in times of conflict and uncertainty. And Woolton pies, despite being made entirely out of vegetables, not only gave your body the health boost it needed, but they felt comforting to share with your family. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else, but Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies, and this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? Bread pudding has been a subject of much discussion in the history books of our developments with food. It would be a bit of an undersell to call it polarizing, since some people claim it is the ultimate comfort food, and there simply is not anything like it. Others think it is an affront to the concept of bread and pudding simultaneously, and fails to really capture the benefits of either. Still, the makeshift recipes from the 1930s were worth trying then, and are still worth trying now, as they put bread pudding on the map and helped it stay there. It was a great way to repurpose leftover stale bread, and despite its record as the poor man's pudding, it was a common recipe in church cookbooks even before the recession hit. All you had to do was get some boiling water, sugar, spices, and bread, and sure, it was not the most appealing or appetizing lump of dough to eat, but it got you through the day, and in times of extreme scarcity, who could ask for more? People that grew up during World War II will know that mixing sawdust with bread to fortify it so that your supply would last twice as long is not quite the urban myth it is made out to be today, but rather a sad fact of a dark time that people would prefer to leave in the past. This was something born purely out of necessity, and a lack of basic necessities like flour. Since it was becoming so scarce across America, people's supplies of bread were running out fast and often. Bread was the only thing families had to eat too. With even that comfort gone, people took to mixing sawdust, which you could even taste in the bread. In some cases, it made the bread go bad faster, such as people when used too much of it. But in most other appliances of this technique, it worked as a filler when nothing else could be used as one. This would also set up a trend of consuming fiber in the 70s, even though most companies used cellulose fiber that was made from sawdust, so it actually does have quite a history in America. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedafests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, saute them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. Sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it, a perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seemed to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed. If people can make an entire fake fish fillet and still be pretty satisfied with it, then other meaty wonders like liver definitely are not too far off the horizon, and chopped liver substitute would eventually prove that right. Something that became incredibly popular in the war-torn landscape of America because all it took was some onions, green lentils, walnuts, and salt and pepper. You had to make a paste out of it to get the texture of chopped liver down, and in terms of taste, this was a completely new experience, yet a significantly cheaper and easier one. It was much easier to get ingredients like these than good quality liver back then, and a lot of citizens stuck with this recipe even after the dust settled because they liked how healthy of an alternative it was. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a Brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the Brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The Brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like Apple Betties than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. Mock cuisine in general really saw its heyday during the harsh times of rationing, especially with all the things that were famously eaten before times got so bad, like brain. People wanted more of their favorites, even if they had to compromise in some way. And things like mock brains would become really popular as a result. Known for being quite heavy on the seasoning and being laced with fat, they incorporated basic spices like hickory smoke, paprika, and garlic. People would typically have it with a tomato sauce if they could spare the ingredients, and it definitely scratched that itch that lots of US meat lovers were having around the nation. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. In Texas as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. So, for onions stuffed with grape nuts, you needed nothing that fancy, not even a lot of seasoning outside of your basic salt and pepper. All you needed was 1.5 cups of pork sausage meat, some melted fat, ketchup, and if you could spare some strips, then bacon. Of course, the key player, grape nuts, would come later when the onions would be chopped and diced mixed with the sausage and the other ingredients. This was then baked for around 40 minutes, and the outcome was a resounding yes from everyone at the dinner table. Dishes that were simple but incredibly effective at filling everyone and leaving them with a happy smile were the holy grail of the 40s and 50s. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup. Especially in the winters, when people needed nutrition more than ever. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. Egg drop soup sounds a little fancier than it is, but have you never had a simple dish that knocked the socks off of you? Just a 2 or 3 ingredient show that really hit home, ticked every box, and left you with a smile? Egg drop soup was a lot like that. It was just diced potatoes and onions, which might get you thinking of the pie we just went over, but this is more like a broth. If chicken broth was there, then of course that was the foundation, but water worked too. Once the potatoes started cooking, you would drizzle some scrambled eggs before adding whole ones. It might look lumpy and score a little less for presentation, but it deserves a solid A+ just for the taste alone, especially if you would pair it with some leftover bread. Cottage cheese being used as a substitute for meat is another factor of cooking that you probably never thought was possible, but is actually well documented. Even the Department of Agriculture agrees that it is a pretty rocking substitute for meat as it contains a lot of protein, and when you need to get your macros in on a budget, you cannot be complaining about the source. Sure, everyone would love to fulfill their battle-action protagonist fantasies of chowing down trays and trays of meat, but we only need so many grams of protein in a day to make a bulk. Dry curd cottage cheese especially contains more protein per pound than beef or lamb, and only chicken and veal beat it at that game. It seems there is a lot of cooking know-how that can be picked up from Americans living in those times. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. Now, how's that for a list of cheap recipes from the 1960s? Let me know which is your favorite in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.